Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. After the story, rate it from 1 to 10. Now let's start. It was, dear listeners, the winter of 1814, a particularly bitter one, as the ton would not cease reminding one another at every gathering where the coal fires blazed and the mulled wine flowed freely. The Thames had frozen solid enough for an impromptu frost fair, much to the delight of the lower classes and the barely concealed interest of certain young ladies and gentlemen of quality who longed to escape their chaperones in the festive chaos. But our story does not begin amidst the boisterous revelry of London's frozen river. No, we must travel northward, to the remote Derbyshire estate of Ravenscroft, where His Royal Highness, Prince Zachary Rutherford, the Duke of Westmoreland, and sixth in line to the throne, though one hardly mentions such gauche matters of succession in polite company, had sequestered himself these past 3 seasons. A prince in exile, the gossips whispered behind their fans at Lady Hertford's musicale. Self-imposed exile, corrected Mrs. Fitzsimmons with that knowing arch of her eyebrow that had once caused a young earl to spill punch down the front of his new waistcoat. After the scandal with the Portuguese ambassador's wife, and the French opera dancer, and the incident with the Russian countess's diamonds. Well, dear listeners, you understand perfectly why Prince Zachary found the isolated comforts of his ancestral estate preferable to the whispers that followed him through London's ballrooms like persistent shadows. At 31 years of age, Prince Zachary was what matchmaking mamas referred to as a magnificent catch, if one could overlook his reputation for breaking hearts as casually as others might break fast. His fortune was vast, his lineage impeccable, his features so handsome that the portrait painter Mr. Lawrence had once declared him an affront to artistic integrity, for no rendering could possibly capture the perfect arrangement of his countenance without appearing as flagrant flattery. The prince stood now at the window of his private study, watching snow swirl in great gusts across the formal gardens. Behind him, a fire roared in the grate, casting his tall figure in dramatic silhouette. His valet, Morris, was arranging correspondence on his desk with the silent efficiency that had made him indispensable. Another invitation from Lady Pembroke, Morris noted, placing the scented paper atop a growing pile. Her 4th this month. She mentions her daughter's accomplishments at the pianoforte most particularly. How fascinating, drawled the prince without turning from the window. I believe I shall be unavailable, as you were for the Chesterfield ball and the Harrington dinner. Precisely, and the Duchess of Montague's. Morris, the prince interrupted, spare me the accounting of my social failures. I am perfectly content here. Morris, who had been with His Royal Highness since his wild university days, permitted himself the faintest of smiles. Of course, sir. Perfectly content. Alone. In winter. Miles from civilization. The prince shot him a dark look, but there was no real anger in it. Solitude suits me. As you say, sir. Little did our handsome, brooding prince know that fate, that most capricious of matchmakers, was already driving a carriage at breakneck speed through the snowstorm toward his doorstep. For while he gazed out at the winter landscape, imagining another peaceful evening with his books and brandy, Miss Theodora Ellsworth was fighting for her very life not 5 miles from his gates. Now, Miss Ellsworth was not the sort of young lady one might expect to find traversing the harsh Derbyshire countryside in the midst of winter's worst fury. The youngest daughter of Baron Ellsworth, she had been raised with all the advantages of her station. A fine education at Miss Pendergast's Academy for Young Ladies, lessons in watercolors and the pianoforte, and a coming-out season that, while not resulting in a match, had at least established her as a young woman of pleasant countenance and lively intellect. At 23, Theodora, or Thea, as her intimates called her, was perilously close to being considered firmly on the shelf. Not that she particularly minded this designation. Unlike many of her peers, Thea found the prospect of spinsterhood rather liberating. After all, a spinster might read whatever books she pleased without a husband's censure, might develop unfashionable interests in botany or astronomy, might even, if she were clever about it, travel. It was this last possibility that had led her to her current predicament, stranded in a snowstorm, her hired carriage overturned in a ditch, her driver unconscious, and night falling fast. "This is entirely my own fault," she muttered, pulling her woefully inadequate cloak tighter around her shoulders as she trudged through knee-deep snow. I should have remained in London with Aunt Margaret instead of insisting on visiting Cousin Jane. Thea had always been stubborn, a trait her mother bemoaned as most unbecoming in a young lady of breeding. But even she had to admit that her current circumstance represented stubbornness carried to a dangerous extreme. The wind howled, slicing through her garments as if they were made of gossamer rather than wool. Her gloved fingers had long since lost all feeling, and her teeth chattered so violently she feared they might crack. Each step required monumental effort, and more than once she stumbled and fell face-first into the snow. "I refuse," she gasped, forcing herself upright once more. To become one of those cautionary tales mothers tell their daughters. Don't be like poor Miss Ellsworth, who froze to death because she was too headstrong to delay her journey. Just as darkness seemed poised to swallow her entirely, Thea caught sight of a distant glow through the trees. Hope surged through her veins, lending strength to her frozen limbs. She altered her course, stumbling toward the light with renewed determination. What she found, after what seemed an eternity of struggling through the snow, was not the humble cottage she had expected, but an imposing stone structure, a hunting lodge, perhaps, or a small manor house. Light spilled from several windows, promising warmth and sanctuary. With the last of her strength, Thea staggered to the door and pounded her fist against the heavy oak. Now, dear listeners, we must return to Prince Zachary, who had retired to the lodge's library with a glass of fine cognac and a volume of Byron's poetry, a rather self-indulgent choice for a man already prone to melancholy, but there we are. He had just settled into his favorite chair when the pounding at the door jolted him from his comfortable repose. "Who the devil could that be in this weather?" he muttered, rising reluctantly. Morris appeared at the library door. "Shall I answer it, sir?" "No, I'll go. It's likely one of the tenants in distress." The prince strode through the hall, irritation warring with concern. When he pulled open the heavy door, a blast of frigid air rushed in, along with something else. A figure so bundled and snow-covered that for a moment he could not discern if it was man or woman. Then the figure raised its face, and Prince Zachary found himself staring into the most remarkable pair of eyes he had ever encountered, large, intelligent, and a most unusual shade of amber, like sunlight through whiskey. They belonged to a young woman whose cheeks were reddened by cold, whose lips were blue with it, and whose expression reflected equal parts relief and wariness. "Forgive the intrusion," she managed through chattering teeth, "but I fear I shall perish if left out in this storm." It was not, perhaps, the most conventional introduction to society, but then again, nothing about what followed would adhere to the usual rules of propriety that govern interactions between eligible gentlemen and unmarried ladies. Prince Zachary, to his credit, recovered quickly from his surprise. "Come in at once," he said, stepping back and calling for Morris. "Bring blankets, hot water, and tell cook to prepare something warm." The woman stumbled across the threshold and would have fallen had the prince not caught her by the elbows. Even through her sodden garments and his shirt sleeves, he could feel how dangerously cold she was. "You're frozen through," he observed with alarm. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms and carried her to the library, where he deposited her gently in the chair nearest the fire. "Sir, she began, but her protest died as violent shivering overtook her. "Conserve your strength," he advised, wrapping his own dressing gown around her shoulders. "Explanations can wait until you're warm." Morris appeared with blankets and a steaming cup of tea into which, Zachary noted with approval, he had added a generous measure of brandy. The prince knelt before his unexpected guest, studying her with undisguised curiosity as color slowly returned to her cheeks. "Better?" he asked after she had taken several sips. She nodded, clutching the cup in both hands. "Much." "You are most kind, mister." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Rutherford," he supplied, omitting his title for reasons he did not fully understand even as he did so. Perhaps it was the novel experience of being viewed as an ordinary gentleman rather than a royal spectacle. "Mr. Rutherford," she repeated. "I am Miss Theodora Ellsworth. My carriage overturned some miles back. The driver was injured, and I set out to find help." "Alone? In this weather?" His tone conveyed his assessment of this decision. Miss Ellsworth's chin lifted slightly. I assure you, sir, remaining with an unconscious man in a broken carriage while night fell seemed the less prudent choice. Zachary found himself suppressing a smile at her spirit. We shall send men to look for your driver once the storm abates, he promised. Until then, you must consider yourself my guest. It was at this moment that Morris cleared his throat in that particular way that suggested his master was about to commit a social blunder of magnificent proportions. Sir, he said quietly, perhaps I should wake Mrs. Winters to attend to Miss Ellsworth. Mrs. Winters was the housekeeper, a woman of such advanced years and rigid propriety that even the prince occasionally felt like a schoolboy in her presence. Her presence would, of course, provide the necessary chaperonage that the situation demanded. Yes, of course, Zachary agreed, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their arrangement. He rose to his feet, putting a proper distance between himself and his guest. Morris will show you to a chamber once you've warmed yourself, Miss Ellsworth. Mrs. Winters will attend to your needs. You are very generous, she said, looking up at him with those extraordinary eyes. Though I fear I am imposing dreadfully. Not at all, he assured her, finding himself strangely reluctant to leave her company. It is rare that I have visitors, particularly ones with such dramatic arrivals. A faint blush colored her cheeks that owed nothing to the cold. I did not intend to create a spectacle. On the contrary, you have provided the most interest this lodge has seen in months. The words escaped before he could consider their wisdom, and he was rewarded with a startled laugh from his guest. Then I am glad my misfortune has proven entertaining, sir. There was something in her manner, a directness, perhaps, or a lack of artifice, that Zachary found immediately refreshing. Here was a young woman who, despite her obvious breeding, spoke to him as if he were simply a man, not a prince. Little did he know that this first encounter, born of desperation and happenstance, would utterly transform his carefully constructed solitude. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the night. Miss Ellsworth, after a night of surprisingly restful sleep in a chamber hastily prepared by Mrs. Winters, found herself being escorted to breakfast by the housekeeper herself, a formidable woman whose expression suggested that harboring unmarried young ladies was not a service the lodge frequently provided. Mr. Rutherford takes breakfast in the morning room at 9. Mrs. Winters informed her with stiff politeness. He has arranged for clothing to be brought from the main house. I've taken the liberty of pressing your own garments, though they remain somewhat damp. You are very kind, Thea replied, wondering what sort of household maintained spare ladies' clothing for unexpected guests. Perhaps Mr. Rutherford entertained female company more often than his isolated location would suggest. The morning room proved to be a charming space with windows that overlooked snow-covered gardens. Mr. Rutherford, whom Thea had not properly observed in her half-frozen state the previous evening, stood as she entered, and she found herself momentarily speechless. In the clear light of day, her host was revealed to be a gentleman of such striking appearance that Thea felt a flutter of something that had nothing to do with her recent ordeal. Tall and broad-shouldered, with features that might have been carved by a sculptor with a particular appreciation for masculine beauty, he cut a figure that would have caused a sensation in any London ballroom. Miss Ellsworth, he greeted her with a slight bow. I trust you slept well. Exceedingly well, thank you, she replied, willing her voice to remain steady. I fear I have put your household to considerable inconvenience. He gestured for her to be seated at the table, which was laid with an assortment of dishes that would not have been out of place at a Mayfair breakfast. Not at all. My men have already departed to search for your driver and carriage. With luck, they'll return with news before midday. Thea accepted a cup of tea from a footman who seemed to materialize at her elbow. You are most kind, Mr. Rutherford. I cannot thank you enough for your hospitality. It is nothing, he assured her, watching with undisguised interest as she helped herself to toast. Though I admit to some curiosity about what brings a young lady of quality to these remote parts in the dead of winter. There was something in his manner, a hint of command beneath the casual inquiry, that struck Thea as unusual. She had the distinct impression that Mr. Rutherford was accustomed to having his questions answered promptly and fully. I was traveling to visit my cousin in Matlock, she explained. Lady Jane Harrington. Perhaps you know her? I do not, he replied, though something flickered in his expression that suggested the name was not unfamiliar. You chose an unfortunate time for social calls. So my aunt informed me before I departed London, Thea admitted with a rueful smile. But I am not one to be easily dissuaded once my mind is set. A quality that nearly resulted in tragedy, he observed dryly. Thea's chin lifted. Or adventure, depending on one's perspective. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. And which is it for you, Miss Ellsworth? Tragedy or adventure? That remains to be seen, doesn't it? She replied, surprising herself with her boldness. The story is not yet concluded. He laughed then, a rich sound that transformed his face entirely, softening the aristocratic angles and lending warmth to his blue eyes. Well said. I look forward to learning how it unfolds. Their breakfast continued in this manner, a verbal sparring match of sorts, each testing the other's wit and boundaries. Thea found herself enjoying the exchange far more than propriety dictated she should. There was something liberating about conversing with a gentleman who knew nothing of her family or position, who had no preconceived notions about her prospects or suitability. As they finished their meal, Morris entered the room with a grave expression that immediately caught his master's attention. What is it? Zachary asked, setting down his cup. The search party has returned, sir. They found the carriage and the driver. Thea rose to her feet, heart pounding. Is he? The man lives, miss, Morris assured her quickly, though he is badly injured. They've taken him to the main house where Dr. Fleming can attend him properly. Relief washed over her, followed swiftly by confusion. The main house, I thought. She glanced around the substantial lodge, with its fine furnishings and staff. Ravenscroft Lodge is a secondary residence on the estate grounds, Zachary explained, rising as well. Ravenscroft Hall is more suitable for medical care. I see, said Thea, though in truth she understood less and less about her mysterious host. What sort of gentleman maintained multiple residences on a single estate? Might I see him? The driver, that is. I feel responsible for his condition. Of course, Zachary replied, though I'm afraid your visit to your cousin will be further delayed. The roads remain impassable, and likely will for several days. The prospect of remaining in Mr. Rutherford's company, unchaperoned but for servants, should have filled Thea with appropriate horror. Instead, she felt a most improper flutter of anticipation. I shall send word to Lady Harrington explaining the circumstance, she said, careful to keep her tone appropriately concerned rather than pleased. Excellent, Zachary replied, offering his arm. Shall we call for the sleigh? I think you'll find Ravenscroft Hall offers more diversion than this humble lodge. And so began 3 days that would forever alter the course of 2 lives. Days filled with conversations by roaring fires, walks through snow-covered gardens, properly bundled and accompanied by Mrs. Winters, naturally, evenings of music and literature, and the gradual revelation of 2 souls who, despite their vastly different stations, discovered in each other a kindred spirit. It was during one such evening, as Thea played a Beethoven sonata on the magnificent pianoforte in the hall's music room, that Zachary realized he had never before met a woman who engaged his mind as thoroughly as she did his senses. Miss Ellsworth was not the classic English rose that society favored. Her features were too distinctive for conventional beauty, her nose a touch too strong, her mouth too wide, her expressions too unguarded. But her eyes, those remarkable amber eyes that flashed with intelligence and humor, that saw through pretense with disconcerting clarity. And her mind, quick, curious, unapologetically eager for knowledge. You play beautifully, he said when she had finished the piece, her fingers lingering on the keys. Thank you, she replied without false modesty, though I suspect you're accustomed to more accomplished musicians. More technically proficient, perhaps, he conceded, moving to stand beside the instrument. But few who play with such evident enjoyment. She smiled up at him. My mother despaired of my technique. Too much passion, not enough precision, she would say. Your mother sounds like a woman well-versed in society's expectations. Oh, indeed. Lady Ellsworth is the very model of propriety. Thea's expression turned wistful. She would be mortified by my current situation, stranded in the home of a bachelor, regardless of how honorable his intentions. It was the first time either had directly acknowledged the impropriety of their arrangement, and the mention of it seemed to charge the air between them. "And are my intentions honorable, Miss Ellsworth?" Zachary asked, his voice lower than he had intended. Thea met his gaze steadily. "I believe they are, Mr. Rutherford, though I confess I know very little about you." It was true. In their days together, Zachary had been careful to reveal little of his true identity, allowing Thea to believe him simply a wealthy gentleman of leisure. The deception troubled him increasingly, yet he could not bear to reintroduce the weight of his title and position, not when, for the first time in years, he felt seen for himself rather than his crown. "What would you know?" he asked, moving to sit beside her on the pianoforte bench, close enough that the subtle fragrance of lavender that clung to her hair reached him, far enough that propriety was not entirely abandoned. "Why do you live here alone?" she asked directly. "A man of your obvious means and education would be welcomed in any drawing room in London." Zachary's smile held a touch of bitterness. "Perhaps I tired of drawing rooms. Or perhaps they tired of you," she suggested with unexpected insight. He laughed softly. "Touché, Miss Ellsworth. Let us say there was mutual fatigue." "A scandal, then," she concluded, her fingers idly tracing a pattern on the pianoforte keys without pressing them. "Something significant enough to drive you to exile, yet not so dire that it affected your fortune or standing." "You have a detective's mind," he observed, both impressed and unnerved by her acuity. "I merely observe," she replied. "And what I observe is a man hiding from something, or someone." The conversation might have ventured into even more dangerous territory had Mrs. Winters not entered at that moment, her expression making it clear that she considered their proximity on the pianoforte bench entirely unsuitable. "Miss Ellsworth," she announced with pointed formality, "Dr. Fleming reports that your driver is conscious and asking after you. Would you care to see him now?" Thea rose immediately. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Winters." As she followed the housekeeper from the room, she glanced back at Zachary with a smile that suggested their conversation was merely postponed, not concluded. Left alone, the prince moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape that had for so long represented sanctuary. Now, for the first time, it seemed more like a prison, a self-imposed isolation that had kept the world at bay, but had also prevented him from encountering someone like Theodora Ellsworth. The next morning brought an unexpected development. As Thea and Zachary breakfasted together, under Mrs. Winters' vigilant eye, Morris entered with the mail, including a letter for Miss Ellsworth that had been delivered by a tenant farmer who had managed to make his way to Matlock. "From your cousin, I presume," Zachary observed as Thea broke the seal. Her expression as she read, however, transformed from curiosity to dismay. "Is something amiss?" he inquired when she had finished. "It seems news of my predicament has traveled faster than I anticipated," she replied, setting the letter down with a sigh. "My cousin writes that she has informed my family of my situation, and that my brother is already en route to rescue me from what she terms a most compromising circumstance." Zachary felt an unexpected pang of regret. "I see. And when might we expect this gallant rescue?" "Tomorrow, if the roads permit," she said, meeting his gaze with an expression he could not quite interpret. "My brother Roland is nothing if not determined." "Then we must make the most of your final day at Ravenscroft," Zachary declared, pushing aside the hollow feeling that had settled in his chest. "What would please you, Miss Ellsworth? A tour of the picture gallery? The conservatory, perhaps?" "Actually," she said with a smile that sent his pulse racing in a most undignified manner, "I should like to hear a story." "A story?" he repeated, bemused. "Yes, your story, Mr. Rutherford. The true one, if you please." Her directness should not still surprise him, and yet it did. "My story may not be suitable for a lady's ears," he warned, only half in jest. "I assure you, sir, I am made of sterner stuff than you might suppose." And so it was that Prince Zachary found himself walking with Miss Ellsworth through the portrait gallery of Ravenscroft Hall, telling her, if not the complete truth, then at least more of it than he had shared with anyone in years. He spoke of the burden of expectations, of mistakes made in youthful rebellion, of scandals both real and exaggerated by gossip. He did not reveal his royal status, but he did not lie about the life he had led before his retreat to Derbyshire. So you see, he concluded as they paused before a portrait of his grandfather, thankfully not identified by the royal crest that had been discreetly draped. I removed myself from society rather than continuing to provide it with fodder for gossip. Thea, who had listened without interruption, studied his face with those perceptive eyes. "And has exile brought you happiness, Mr. Rutherford?" "It has brought me peace," he replied after a moment. "Or it had, until a frozen woman appeared at my door with a story that terrified me." "Terrified you?" she echoed, clearly puzzled. "I wasn't aware my tale was so frightening." "Not your tale of the overturned carriage," he clarified, turning to face her fully. "The story you brought with you, of courage and directness, of intelligence unclouded by artifice or ambition. It terrified me because it made me realize how empty my carefully constructed solitude had become." The confession hung between them, far too honest for a gentleman who had known a lady mere days. Propriety dictated that Thea should deflect such raw sentiment with a witty rejoinder or change the subject entirely. Instead, she met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps it is not solitude you require, but simply the right company." "Perhaps," he agreed softly, aware that they had drawn closer to each other than was strictly proper, even with Mrs. Winters hovering at a discreet distance. "Though I fear the right company might find my circumstances less than ideal once all truths are known." Thea tilted her head slightly. "You still harbor secrets, then?" "One significant one," he admitted, "though I find myself increasingly reluctant to maintain it." "Then don't," she suggested simply. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Zachary opened his mouth to speak, to confess his true identity, to declare the feelings that had somehow blossomed in the space of 3 days, when Morris appeared at the gallery entrance. "Sir," he announced with the careful neutrality that Zachary knew masked urgency, "there is a matter requiring your immediate attention." The matter, as it transpired, was the arrival of a royal messenger bearing dispatches that could not be ignored. The king's health had taken a turn, and Prince Zachary's presence was required in London with all haste. As Zachary read the urgent summons in the privacy of his study, he felt the carefully constructed walls of his retreat crumbling around him. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending to be simply Mr. Rutherford. Duty called, as it always would. And Miss Ellsworth? What of the connection that had formed between them, fragile yet undeniable? She would learn his true identity soon enough, if not from his own lips, then certainly from her brother or cousin. The thought of her feeling deceived, of seeing in her eyes the calculation that inevitably followed the revelation of his title, was almost unbearable. Yet the alternative, parting without explanation, without at least attempting to preserve what had begun between them, was worse still. Decision made, Zachary summoned Morris. "Prepare my traveling coach," he instructed. "We leave for London tomorrow." "Very good, sir," Morris replied, then hesitated. "And Miss Ellsworth?" "Her brother arrives tomorrow as well. They will depart together." "I see." Morris's tone conveyed his understanding of all that remained unsaid. "And before then?" Zachary drew a deep breath. "Before then, I have a truth to tell." That evening, as snow began to fall once more beyond the windows of Ravenscroft Hall, Prince Zachary requested the pleasure of Miss Ellsworth's company in the library after dinner. Mrs. Winters, displaying a surprising flexibility in matters of propriety, agreed to act as chaperone while maintaining a distance that allowed for private conversation. Thea entered the library with obvious curiosity, dressed in a borrowed gown of deep blue that set off her complexion to advantage. The past days had restored her fully from her ordeal. Indeed, she seemed to glow with a vitality that made Zachary's heart clench painfully. "You wish to speak with me, Mr. Rutherford?" she inquired, taking the seat he offered near the fire. "I did." He remained standing, too restless to sit. "I received news today that necessitates my departure for London tomorrow." "I see," she said, her expression carefully neutral. "A fortunate coincidence, as my brother arrives tomorrow as well." "Not entirely a coincidence," he admitted. "The roads have been passable for a day now. Your brother could have arrived today had I not delayed the messenger." Her eyebrows rose. "You delayed word of my whereabouts reaching my family?" "Only by hours," he hastened to assure her. "And only because I wished for more time in your company." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "That was most improper of you, sir." "I know," he acknowledged. It is one of many improprieties for which I must now beg your forgiveness. Thea studied him, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight. You're finally going to tell me who you really are, aren't you? Yes. He drew a deep breath. My name is indeed Zachary Rutherford, but I am also His Royal Highness, Prince Zachary, Duke of Westmoreland. He watched carefully for her reaction, the widening of eyes, the gasp of surprise, perhaps followed by the calculating look he had come to expect from women who suddenly saw in him a path to titles and wealth. Instead, Thea's lips curved in a small smile. I suspected as much. Now it was Zachary's turn to be shocked. You knew? Not with certainty, she clarified. But there were clues. The grandeur of Ravenscroft, the deference of your staff, certain mannerisms that spoke of more than mere wealth. She tilted her head slightly. The portrait gallery was most illuminating, particularly the painting of King George III that bears a striking resemblance to your grandfather. Zachary stared at her, torn between admiration and disbelief. And you said nothing? It wasn't my secret to reveal, she replied simply. I assumed you had your reasons for the deception. I did, he acknowledged, moving to sit opposite her at last. When you arrived that night, half frozen and unaware of my identity, I experienced something I haven't known in years, the pleasure of being seen as a man, not a prince. And did you find the experience satisfactory? She asked, her tone light though her eyes remained serious. I found it transformative, he admitted. These past days with you have been the most honest of my life, despite the fundamental dishonesty at their core. Thea was silent for a moment, absently tracing the pattern on the arm of her chair. I appreciate your telling me the truth now, Your Highness, though I confess I'm not entirely certain what one does with such information. The etiquette books at Miss Pendergast's failed to cover the protocol for discovering one's host is royalty. The formality of the title from her lips pained him more than he could have anticipated. Please, he said quickly, when we are alone, or as alone as propriety permits, I would ask that you continue to call me Mr. Rutherford, or Zachary if you are feeling particularly bold. Her smile returned, warming him more effectively than the blazing fire. Very well, Mr. Rutherford. Though I wonder what purpose such informality serves when tomorrow we both return to our proper places in the world. The question hung between them, laden with implications neither had yet dared voice aloud. Zachary leaned forward, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her remarkable eyes. What if I don't wish to return to my proper place? He asked quietly. What if these days have shown me that the life I built was missing its most essential component? And what component might that be? Thea whispered, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. A partner, he said simply. Someone who sees the man beneath the title. Someone whose mind challenges mine, whose spirit awakens my own. He paused, gathering courage for words he had never imagined himself speaking. Someone like you, Theodora. The use of her given name was an intimacy that should have shocked her. Instead, she seemed to glow brighter, as if illuminated from within. You hardly know me, she reminded him, though without conviction. I know enough, he countered. I know you possess courage that borders on recklessness. I know your mind is as sharp as your tongue. I know you play Beethoven with passion rather than precision. His voice softened. And I know that I cannot bear the thought of returning to a life without you in it. Thea's breath caught audibly. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Rutherford? At this moment? Correspondence, he replied with a smile that did not quite mask the intensity of his gaze. Letters, to begin, a proper courtship, conducted with all the decorum your family and my position demand. And after that, she pressed, leaning forward until barely a handspan separated them. After that, he murmured, if you find yourself able to tolerate both the man and the prince, I would propose something far more permanent. Mrs. Winters chose that moment to clear her throat with pointed emphasis from her position near the door, reminding them both of her presence. Thea straightened immediately, her cheeks flushed. I should retire, she said, rising from her chair. Tomorrow promises to be a day of significant transitions. Zachary stood as well, taking her gloved hand in his. Will you permit the correspondence I suggest? Her smile then, radiant, unguarded, filled with promise, was answer enough, but she spoke the words he longed to hear nonetheless. I believe I would find such an arrangement most agreeable, Mr. Rutherford. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was entirely proper, yet somehow conveyed the depth of emotion that propriety forbade him from expressing more directly. "Until tomorrow, then," he said as he released her hand. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, curtsying before following Mrs. Winters from the library. Left alone, Prince Zachary moved to the window, watching snow drift past in the darkness. For the first time in years, the prospect of returning to London, to duty, to scrutiny, to the world he had fled, filled him not with dread but with anticipation. The frozen woman who had appeared at his door had indeed brought a terrifying story. The story of how a life carefully arranged for solitude could be utterly transformed by the right companion. And what a story it would be. The Tun, dear listeners, was utterly unprepared for the sensation that greeted it upon Prince Zachary's return to London society. The prodigal prince, it seemed, had not only abandoned his self-imposed exile, but had done so with a newfound purpose that manifested in his attendance at select gatherings, his renewed interest in matters of state, and, most intriguingly, his marked attention to a certain Miss Theodora Ellsworth, daughter of Baron Ellsworth, a young lady previously considered respectable but unremarkable. "She is not even a great beauty," Lady Pembroke complained behind her fan as she watched the prince lead Miss Ellsworth onto the dance floor at the Hartington ball. "What can he possibly see in her? They say she appeared at his door in Derbyshire during that dreadful snowstorm." The Countess of Merryweather replied with obvious relish. Half frozen and entirely unchaperoned. They were alone together for days before her brother arrived. "Surely not," gasped Mrs. Fitzsimmons. "Lady Ellsworth would never permit such a scandal." Lady Ellsworth knew nothing of it until it was too late, the Countess confided. By then, the damage, or the miracle, depending on one's perspective, was done. On the dance floor, oblivious to the speculation swirling around them, Prince Zachary and Miss Ellsworth moved through the patterns of the quadrille with perfect composure, though observers with keen eyes might have noted the way their gazes lingered upon each other, the secretive smiles they exchanged, the subtle brush of fingers during the appropriate figures of the dance. "You are causing quite a stir," Thea murmured as they came together in the dance. Surely it is you who has set the Tun ablaze with curiosity," Zachary replied with a smile that made several watching debutantes sigh audibly. The mysterious Miss Ellsworth, who somehow tamed the notorious Prince Zachary. Thea's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Is that what they're saying? How disappointing. I had hoped to be cast as the scheming adventuress who ensnared the innocent prince through nefarious means." His laugh drew even more attention. "Perhaps we should encourage that version. It has a certain dramatic appeal." "My mother would expire on the spot," Thea observed dryly. "She is barely recovering from the shock of finding her spinster daughter the object of royal attention." "And your father?" "Is torn between pride and suspicion. He cannot quite believe his daughter has attracted such an illustrious suitor without some form of trickery." The dance separated them momentarily, but when they came together again, Zachary's expression had grown serious. "Does their disapproval trouble you?" "Not disapproval, precisely," Thea clarified. "More bewilderment. They raised me to make a suitable match with a respectable gentleman of modest title and fortune. They never prepared for this. This being a courtship conducted under the scrutiny of the entire Tun, with a gentleman whose royal status means our every interaction is noted, discussed, and likely embellished." The dance concluded, and Zachary led her from the floor with perfect correctness, though his hand lingered on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Does the scrutiny distress you?" "Not as much as it should," she admitted as they reached the relative privacy of an alcove where her mother, acting as chaperone, sat in conversation with the Duchess of Pemberton. "I find I can endure considerable gossip for the privilege of your company." "High praise indeed," he murmured, his eyes conveying far more than his words. "Though I wonder if you'll maintain that sentiment after reading the latest correspondence I've sent to your father." Thea's eyes widened slightly. "What correspondence?" But Zachary merely smiled enigmatically before bowing to Lady Ellsworth and excusing himself, leaving Thea to wonder, and the watching Tun to speculate, about the nature of his cryptic remark. She did not have long to wait for enlightenment. Upon returning home that evening, Thea was summoned to her father's study, an unusual occurrence that immediately set her pulse racing. Baron Ellsworth, a dignified gentleman of 60 whose military bearing had not softened with age, sat behind his desk with an expression Thea could not quite interpret. A letter bearing the royal seal lay open before him. "Sit down, Theodora," he instructed, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Thea obeyed, folding her hands in her lap to disguise their sudden trembling. "You wish to speak with me, father? I have received a letter from His Royal Highness, Prince Zachary," he announced, tapping the document with one finger. "A most extraordinary letter." "Indeed," Thea managed, struggling to maintain her composure. "He has formally requested permission to pay his addresses to you," her father continued, studying her face carefully, "with the explicit intention of making you his wife." Though she had suspected, hoped, even, that this was the content of Zachary's mysterious correspondence, hearing it stated so plainly by her father sent a wave of dizzying joy through Thea that she struggled to conceal. "I see," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "And how did you respond?" Baron Ellsworth's eyebrows rose. "You do not seem surprised by this development. Prince Zachary has made his intentions reasonably clear during our acquaintance," Thea replied with careful honesty, "though he had not informed me that he had approached you formally." Her father leaned back in his chair, regarding her thoughtfully. "The prince's reputation, as I'm sure you're aware, has not always been exemplary." "I am aware of the gossip," Thea acknowledged. "As is he. Indeed, he has been most forthcoming about his past indiscretions." "Has he?" The Baron's expression sharpened. "And what assurances has he offered that such behavior will not resume after marriage?" The question was blunt, even indelicate, but Thea appreciated her father's directness. "He has offered the only assurance that matters, his word as a gentleman." "I believe him, father." Baron Ellsworth was silent for a long moment, studying his daughter with an intensity that might have unnerved her had she not been so certain of her own mind. Finally, he spoke. "You love him." It was not a question, but Thea answered it nonetheless. "I do. Not for his title or position, but for the man he is when all of that is stripped away." "You've seen this man? Beyond the prince?" "Yes," she said simply. "In Derbyshire, when circumstances removed the barriers of rank and formality. I know him, father, in ways that perhaps few others do." The Baron sighed, a sound that contained both resignation and a measure of pride. "Then it seems I have little choice but to give my consent." He tapped the letter again. "Though I suspect His Royal Highness anticipated as much. The remainder of this missive outlines the settlements he proposes, terms so generous they border on the ridiculous." Thea felt her cheeks warm. "I have no interest in his fortune." "Fortunate, as you're to have very little say in the matter," her father replied dryly. "Royal marriages are negotiated at levels far beyond a mere baron's daughter and her preferences." "But you have consented?" Thea pressed, unwilling to celebrate until she was certain. Baron Ellsworth's stern expression softened slightly. "I have. Though I confess, Theodora, when your mother and I envisioned your future, we never imagined it would include a crown." "Nor did I," she admitted with a small smile. "Life takes unexpected turns, it seems." "Indeed it does." He rose from his desk, coming around to take her hands in his. "I only hope, my dear, that this particular turn brings you happiness." Thea stood as well, embracing her father with uncharacteristic impulsiveness. "It already has, father. It already has." The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of activity that transformed the previously unremarkable Ellsworth household into the center of London's attention. Royal messengers came and went, bearing correspondence and gifts. Modistes arrived with fabrics and designs for a trousseau fit for a princess. Society invitations poured in from families who had previously considered the Ellsworths too insignificant for notice. Through it all, Thea maintained the composure that had first caught Prince Zachary's attention, neither overwhelmed by the sudden elevation of her circumstances nor falsely modest about the match she had secured. When they were together, always properly chaperoned, yet managing to find moments of relative privacy, she remained the same direct, intelligent woman who had stumbled frozen to his door. It was this consistency, this essential Theaness untouched by the trappings of royalty, that confirmed for Zachary the rightness of his choice. She would be his anchor in the stormy seas of court life, his compass when duty threatened to overwhelm humanity. Their formal betrothal was announced with all the pomp that a royal engagement demanded, though both Zachary and Thea insisted on certain departures from tradition. Most notably, their request for a shorter engagement period than was customary for matches of such significance. 6 months is an eternity, Zachary complained during a carriage ride through Hyde Park, with Thea's mother maintaining a discreet presence opposite them. Surely 3 would suffice. The arrangements alone require at least 4, Thea reminded him, though her own impatience matched his. A royal wedding is not a simple affair. It could be, he suggested, lowering his voice so that Lady Ellsworth, seemingly absorbed in watching the fashionable parade of carriages and riders, might not hear. We could elope to Scotland, be married within the week. Thea laughed, the sound drawing appreciative glances from passing gentlemen who had not yet accustomed themselves to seeing the once rakish prince so thoroughly captivated. And deny the spectacle they've been anticipating? How unkind of you. I care nothing for their anticipation, Zachary replied, his gaze so intense that Thea felt herself blush. My own has become nearly unbearable. Patience, Your Highness, she murmured, her tone gently teasing despite the warmth his words kindled within her. Good things come to those who wait. So I've been told, he said with a sigh that was only partly theatrical, though I've never been particularly skilled at waiting. This exchange, like so many between them, reflected the playful intimacy that had developed since their unexpected meeting, an intimacy that continued to baffle and fascinate society observers who had known the prince only as a detached, sometimes cynical figure. He is utterly transformed, declared Lady Jersey at a dinner where the couple had been the center of attention. One would hardly recognize him as the same man who scandalized us so thoroughly with the Russian Countess affair. It is the Ellsworth girl's influence, opined Lord Pembroke. Though what spell she has cast over him remains a mystery. She is pleasant enough, I suppose, but hardly the diamond one might expect to capture a prince. It is precisely because she is not a diamond that she has succeeded where others failed, observed the elderly Duchess of Richmond, whose decades at court had honed her perception to razor sharpness. She wants the man, not the prince. He has never experienced that before. And indeed, as the engagement progressed and the wedding preparations reached fever pitch, it became increasingly clear to all who observed them that theirs was a match based on genuine affection rather than convenience or ambition. The wedding itself, when it finally arrived on a perfect June day, was everything a royal ceremony should be, elaborate, dignified, steeped in tradition, yet somehow infused with the distinctive character of the couple at its center. Thea, radiant in a gown of silver tissue overlaid with Brussels lace, her mother's diamonds at her throat and orange blossoms in her hair, moved down the aisle of Westminster Abbey with a grace that belied her non-aristocratic upbringing. Zachary, resplendent in his dress uniform, watched her approach with an expression of such naked adoration that even the most cynical observers found themselves moved. The vows, spoken in clear voices that carried throughout the vast space, were the traditional ones, yet invested with a sincerity that transformed ancient words into personal promises. When the Archbishop of Canterbury pronounced them man and wife, the cheers that erupted outside the abbey where crowds had gathered since dawn suggested that the public had embraced this unconventional match with enthusiasm. The wedding breakfast that followed at St. James's Palace was a glittering affair attended by royalty, nobility, and diplomats from across Europe. Yet amidst the splendor and ceremony, those closest to the couple noted the way they gravitated toward each other despite the constant demands on their attention, the private smiles they exchanged across crowded rooms, the subtle touches that spoke of genuine connection rather than formal partnership. It was during this celebration that an elderly duchess, whose name has been lost to history but whose wit remains legendary, approached the new Princess Theodora with a knowing smile. "Your Royal Highness," she said, executing a perfect curtsy despite her advanced years, "permit me to offer my congratulations on achieving what many considered impossible." "Thank you, Your Grace," Thea replied warmly, "though I confess I'm not entirely certain what impossibility you refer to." The Duchess's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Why, the taming of Prince Zachary, of course." London has not seen such a transformation since beauty civilized her beast. Thea laughed, a sound that drew her husband's attention from across the room. I assure you, Your Grace, there was no taming involved. Merely recognition. Recognition? The Duchess echoed, intrigued. Yes, Thea said, her gaze meeting Zachary's as he made his way toward them. Recognition of a soul that complements one's own. The prince needed no taming. He needed only to be seen clearly. The Duchess followed her gaze, noting the way the prince's expression softened as he approached his bride. Well said, Your Highness. And most perceptive. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. You'll do very well at court, I think. Very well indeed. As the celebrations continued and eventually concluded, as the royal couple departed for their honeymoon at a secluded estate in the Lake District, as life gradually settled into new patterns, the story of their unlikely meeting became something of a legend among the ton, embellished with each retelling, of course, as all good stories are. Some versions claimed that Miss Ellsworth had deliberately orchestrated her accident near the prince's estate, a scheme worthy of the most ambitious of mamas. Others insisted that supernatural forces had guided her to his door on that snowy night, fulfilling an ancient prophecy known only to a select few. The truth, as Prince Zachary and Princess Theodora knew, was both simpler and more profound than any of these fanciful tales. It was a story of two people who, against all odds and expectations, recognized in each other something essential and irreplaceable, and had the courage to build a life upon that recognition. Years later, when their children begged for the story of how their parents met, the prince would begin with a twinkle in his eye. It was the coldest winter in memory when a frozen woman asked to enter my cabin. And Princess Theodora would interrupt with a laugh. It was hardly a cabin, my dear. More a substantial hunting lodge on an enormous estate. Details, my love, he would reply with a wave of his hand. The important part is that her story terrified me. Terrified you, their children would echo, wide-eyed. Indeed, the prince would confirm, taking his wife's hand in his. For it was the story of how thoroughly one's life can change in an instant, when the right person appears at one's door. And so, dear listeners, concludes our tale of frozen encounters and thawed hearts, of princes who needed rescuing and ladies who did the rescuing, of love that flourishes in the most unexpected of circumstances. I trust you have found it diverting, and perhaps even a touch instructive. After all, one never knows when a snowstorm might bring an unexpected visitor to one's door, or what stories they might bring with them.